Good evening. Welcome to our second program as part of Democracy in Action. I'm Stephanie Fry, the museum educator at Capital Jewish Museum, and I'm really excited that you're joining us for tonight's Women's History Month program. Tonight's program is a webinar, which means you're only going to be able to see myself, other panelists and speakers. You won't be able to see other attendees. Right now you're seeing my screen, and when I'm done showing you a little bit about the museum, you'll see all of our speakers. And during tonight's Q&A, we ask that you put all of your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom. So you'll see that's 2 chat bubbles and Q&As written next to it. You can click that and put any questions for our panelists in there. So before we get started, I just want to show you all a little bit about Capital Jewish Museum and really the site of the future museum, where you're going to be able to attend more programs like this when we open our doors in 2022, which is so close at this point in time. This right now is our construction site. This is what the construction site at 3rd and F Street Northwest looks like this past week. The building is flying up. The second floor was poured for concrete. The columns have gone in, and we are putting that 3rd floor on right now around the historic synagogue. When the building is complete, it will look like this. This is the 1876 historic synagogue. It has been moved several times around the city and now lives at 3rd and F Street Northwest, which is just 1 block from the Judiciary Square Metro. We're building this modern structure next to it at the moment, and that's where the museum and the historic synagogue will connect to one another via a bridge right here between these trees that you can't see in this image. But in the museum, we will have a huge gallery space. And so this is an eagle eye view. You'll never see this in the museum as we're looking down from the top. But a lot of the stories that we're going to hear about tonight and the topics we're going to discuss are going to be here in the museum galleries for you to come and explore, for your families to come and explore. And we're really looking forward to being able to welcome you into our doors to see these themes. So I'm Stephanie, as I mentioned, for those of you who are just coming in now. I'm the museum educator at Capital Jewish Museum. And the themes that emerge from tonight's talk, such as advocacy, organizing, lobbying, and Jewish identity, will be explored throughout the exhibits and in our future programs and events. I'm looking forward to hearing from today's panelists about how their Jewish identities contribute to the work and learning some new tools that I can use as an advocate myself. So with that, I'm joined tonight by 2 members of the Capital Jewish Museum Teen Council, and I'm going to introduce them as they help me facilitate and moderate tonight's conversation. So first joining me is Jennifer, who is a junior at School Without Walls in Washington, D.C., and she goes to shul at Adas, Israel. She participates in a number of other Jewish activities, such as religious school and Israeli dance, and she has written articles for the News Media Alliance. Hannah is a sophomore at Walter Johnson High School, and she lives in Bethesda, Maryland, and has lobbied Congress a few times herself with several different organizations within her school and her community. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jennifer, who's going to get us started by introducing our speakers.
Thank you, Stephanie. Nan Aron is the founder and president of the Alliance for Justice, the leading progressive advocacy organization on justice issues since its inception in 1979. Under Nan's leadership, AFJ has grown to become a national association of more than 120 groups representing a variety of progressive constituencies. Marcia Greenberger is the founder and co-president emerita of the National Women's Law Center, which was established about 50 years ago. Ms. Greenberger has received many accolades for her work in women's rights and advocacy over her lifetime as a lobbyist in the DC area. And last but certainly not least, Judith L. Lichtman served as president of the National Partnership for Women and Families for over 40 years until 2004 and is presently their senior advisor. She has been recognized and awarded for her work in advocacy for women and families' rights by civic and legal organizations, business and labor leaders, as well as many others. And now I'm going to turn it over to Hannah for some questions.
Thank you. So starting off with our first question, how did you get into this line of work, and what was it like being a woman advocate when you first started? And let's start with Judy.
Well, I think there's an easy answer to how I got into this work. And I would say at my parents' dinner table. My parents were labor activists, and I grew up believing that you were put on this earth to make it a better place. So I did a very non-traditional thing and went to law school in the early 60s, not to date myself too much. And I went to law school because I wanted to be a civil rights activist. So I was very directed from the very beginning.
Awesome. Let's move on to Marcia.
Well, I also was exposed at my parents' dinner table to politics and public policy and debates that were happening over what the government was doing. And I remember coming home in the afternoons, and the McCarthy hearings were on in the afternoons, which my parents were absolutely furious about. And so I was always interested in public policy issues. And I grew up in school in the 60s, and that was a time where young people were very active, especially around the Vietnam War. Also, for a few years, there was the Kennedy administration, which I thought was the most glamorous thing I had ever seen in my entire life. And I grew up in Philadelphia, and I had two ambitions, which I thought were beyond the pale. One was to participate in the Miss America pageant, which was in Atlantic City, very close to Philadelphia. And that was one of these out of the question dreams. And then the second out of the question dream was to get involved in public policy in Washington. They both seemed beyond any reach of anything possible that I could do. In college, I thought I would end up, and I graduated from college in 1967. I thought I would become a teacher in high school, which was a career that women did in my generation. And I had two girlfriends who said we should go to law school. And I didn't even know a lawyer at the time, but I thought law school sounds like maybe that would be some public policy. Maybe there would be some government way of being involved. I had the vaguest notions of it, but they said, come on, you can do it. We're going to do it together. And they took me by the hand, and thanks to them, and they are still dear friends of mine, the three of us went off to law school. And there were not many of us who were lawyers, but that taught you how to be an advocate. And there are many ways of being an advocate. You can do business law, etc., but you can also get involved in government and public policy, and that's the route I ended up taking.
All right, awesome. Let's move on to Nan.
So I guess I got interested in social justice at my great-grandfather's knee. He actually wrote a book chronicling his life, which became important to me as I was growing up. And he was notable for two reasons. One, he basically worshiped two gods. One, the God we know, and he also worshiped Franklin Delano Roosevelt and was a huge fan of FDR's. He lived in New York during the Depression and came to appreciate the programs that FDR created that really saved the country. Pretty much like the Relief Act that is rolling out today in America. The other notable thing about my great-grandfather is he started out as a peddler in the Lower East Side, as many Jews did who came over from Eastern Europe. First, he sold herring off of that cart. Then he sold aprons, and then sold dresses, and was able to make a pretty good living. And on Friday nights, he and his wife, my great-grandmother, would open their homes up to anyone in the neighborhood who wanted dinner, a free dinner at their home. So taught me some very wonderful values. I, during college, worked in prisons, and that certainly gave me a firsthand view of what life is like for the poorest among us and marginalized. But actually, I wanted to work at the State Department. I had studied Chinese at college and wanted to work in the China division at the State Department. And my father said, you know, why don't you go and talk to someone who knows about the State Department, which I did. And I was told point blank, if you're Jewish and a woman, you will never, ever make it anywhere at the State Department. You'll never be promoted. So I kind of cast aside that one dream and came back to my roots and working in prisons, and became interested in social justice.
That's so awesome. So we're going to move on to our next question, which is, why did you choose to build organizations and choose to influence policy from the outside rather than inside the government? And let's start with Marcia this time.
Well, there were two reasons for that. When I graduated from law school, it was a time when many places wouldn't hire women. And and it was also the Nixon administration. So, and at that point, many of the progressive parts of the government were being dismantled, or they were being shifted in their purpose and the way they worked. So I didn't see the government as a place that would be appealing to me at that particular time. And there were many different arenas. One thing I thought about possibly was clerking for a judge, but most of the judges in the District of Columbia at the time wouldn't hire women, and the faculty at the law school said most of them have a policy of not hiring women as law clerks. So I scratched that off my list. And I ended up going to a small law firm that focused mostly on tax law. I was the first woman associate, and the firm was called Kaplan and Drysdale. And I liked it because it was small, it was young, it was new. Mortimer Kaplan had been the commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service in the Kennedy administration. And they cared a lot about public interest work. And I thought I would give it a try. And when I was in law school, I loved tax law. And I realized the reason I loved tax law is because I loved what the tax law reflected the policy of what really mattered in this country. It's showed me the money, how you spend the money, and what interests are valued and what aren't, and all reflected in the tax code. Now, practice of tax law was not quite that, but I met some wonderful people there, including Arthur Goldberg, who had been a justice in the Supreme Court. And during the Johnson administration, he was talked into stepping down and going to the UN to try to bring peace to the Middle East. He'd been a labor lawyer, a very, very successful one. That did not work. And he decided he liked the idea of private practice, but in a small firm. And he had been the Secretary of Labor in the Kennedy administration and had become friendly with Mortimer Kaplan. So he came to Kaplan and Drysdale and had office space there and worked with the young associates. And so he became a mentor of mine. And one of the things that he did in the public interest was chair the board of one of the first public interest legal advocacy groups that had been set up in the country in Washington called the Center for Law and Social Policy. And he, using all of his stature and contacts, helped the center as the chair of the board get foundation funding to get it started. And it got started in 1969. So I heard while there that it was a young staff of male lawyers mostly, and bright, committed women who were in the administrative support staff, and also some law students who came to get some credit working in this public interest place. Well, the women had a revolt in 1972 with a list of demands. And their revolt was, one, they wanted the center to work on women's rights issues. Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just begun her work at the ACLU and won her first big Supreme Court case in 1971. And they thought this new public interest law firm should work on women's rights. 2, hire women lawyers. So that was a second demand. 3, they thought their pay should be increased because they were doing sophisticated work, but they thought they were getting paid less than they should because those were administrative support staff, secretarial jobs, etc., were paid less because women had them. And then their 4th demand was no more serving coffee. Anyway, these young lawyers were very open to the idea of hiring somebody to work on women's rights, although they really were not so sure in those early years what that would entail. And so Arthur Goldberg vouched for me, and I got to get this, what turned into the dream job that lasted for 50 years, to start a women's rights project at the Center for Law and Social Policy. So this, in a sense, fell into my lap. I was very lucky. And the government at the time, as I said, was not very appealing. So this gave me the chance to be an advocate in a way that I wanted to be.
Awesome. Let's move on to Nan.
So my story is quite different. In my law school class, I think there were 4 or 5 other women, and that was it. So law school for me was intimidating, but what I say to young women today is, and men, is I found, and I still think it's true, law school to be a door opener. If you can afford it, and I know how expensive it is, it only cost me, I think, $3,000 a semester when I went. But if you can do it, it was then and still is a door opener. I think for me, those early years were some of the best years in terms of coinciding with the beginning of the women's movement. So women were beginning to be accepted, as Marcia explains. Although nothing was really handed to us, we had to create opportunities and structures for ourselves and others. But they were very good years, and the women were beginning to be accepted as full partners. I started out in government for 3.5 years at the Equal Opportunity Commission, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Had a wonderful time there, but I had a restless soul. I had was a big troublemaker in college, and going during the Vietnam War, and very actively engaged in opposing the war. And fighting the good fight was deeply embedded in my psyche. And I just felt, as wonderful as that commission was, I needed to be on the outside, really weighing in on agencies like the EEOC and Congress. So I created an organization, and my first grant from the Ford Foundation, don't be too excited, was all of $5,000. And I say to anyone thinking about nonprofit work, if I can do it on $5,000, anyone can do it. So, and from there, we've fortunately grown. That's my very quick story.
That's great. We're going to move on to Judy. You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry, I was trying to be respectful of others and then forgot to turn myself back on. I apologize. My answer is some combination of Marcia and Nan's. I started out working for the federal government, right out of law school, working to enforce what was then the brand new Civil Rights Act of 1964. And my first job was to enforce the new school desegregation federal requirements, and had a number of federal government jobs. Of course, I was a brand new doobie lawyer, so I was coming into government not at a level where I could make real policy changes. I was a foot soldier, if you pardon the metaphor. And what Marcia said has certain resonance. The government very quickly became not very friendly to civil rights enforcement. So looking outside for opportunities as an advocate to make and work to make government work for people who are needing the protections of government safety nets and, of course, civil rights protections, became a much more hospitable place for somebody like me who was also a troublemaker, and making systems work from the outside became a much more hospitable kind of career choice for me.
Awesome. So I'm gonna hand it over to Jennifer for our next question.
All right. First, the question is: Did being Jewish influence your work and/or your policy preferences? And for this one, I'm going to start with Nan.
I think so. Certainly had my many years at Sunday school and Hebrew school. But I think for me, so much about my values derives from my family. And, we're approaching in a week or two the holiday of Passover. And I do think sitting around that table, talking about freedom with people I loved, really inspired my sense of community. And in my work, it's all about coalitions, community, stakeholders, people. And I think much of that desire to be part of a larger group and collective action, knowing that none of us can achieve what we want alone, maybe grew out of some of those holidays where we all got together and spoke and sang, and the rituals were very important. Yeah, I think it did.
That's wonderful. Judy?
So I definitely think that many of my life's career choices stem from a very clear Jewish heritage. And I want to read a very short sentence to you all from the Talmud that I believe was one around that kitchen table. And it is not your duty to finish the work of repairing the world, but neither are you at liberty to neglect it. And I think that was a guiding principle of my families growing up. They were clearly, I am a baby of the 1940s. So World War II and the Holocaust was something that we were keenly aware of from me, my earliest age, to the kind of anti-Semitism that Marcia and Nan alluded to the kind of sexism and racism we grew up with, that I don't believe that any of us at the time had the language to talk about intersectionality, but that was certainly foremost in our minds and in our thoughts of understanding the intersectional harm that was done to people as a result of their race or their religion or their age or disability. And working in the field was almost a natural choice for trying to repair the world with some humility, understanding that people like the three of us will probably not finish the job, but it's not our choice to stop trying.
Absolutely. And Marcia?
Well, I think it also for me was central. We lived in a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was largely comprised of Jewish families. I went to a conservative synagogue and was bat mitzvahed at the synagogue, which was a relatively recent thing to have for girls at that time, and not all synagogues did. And that was a very empowering thing, to get up in public and have something that you had to learn how to do that you weren't necessarily comfortable with, and say it and do it. Now, it was Friday night. Saturday was the bar mitzvahs for boys, and the girls' bat mitzvahs were on Friday night, which was clearly seen as second in status. And also, while it was very empowering, the girls did not read from the Torah. That was only allowed for the boys at that time. And there was an interesting, certainly the whole concept of tikkun olam and women's sisterhoods and organizations of women who were expected to be able to make a difference and do good things. That was very central and very present in my growing up, to thinking that women were expected to have a brain and be able to do things, but it was always within certain constraints. And so the notion of being Jewish, and I was very aware of anti-Semitism and what it meant for the Jews if something happened that was, and if, for goodness sakes, the worst is if some Jewish businessman usually did something illegal, then it was just a terrible embarrassment. What was it going to mean for the Jews? It was a real sense of community, of being a Jewish, and having responsibility for the community, but also a sense that you face discrimination. And there wasn't probably in looking back, unusual that I would have been drawn to this firm. Mortimer Kaplan was Jewish and Arthur Goldberg was Jewish as well, and they became good friends. And the Jewish religion and Israel were important to them and certainly to Arthur Goldberg. And I grew up thinking that part of my history and part of my tradition and part of my identity was to use whatever talents I had to make a difference. And while I was aware of the fact that there were barriers that I'd have to overcome, both because of my religion and because of my gender, I also had a sense of empowerment from the Jewish religion that I had grown up in.
Well said, thank you.
I'm going to open it up to a question from the audience that we have. I think that there are so many common themes that we're seeing, thinking about how in the early days, maybe sexism or racism, even anti-Semitism was something that you noticed in your work. Our audience is wondering, who in those early days was your mentor? Who did you look to for advice, especially since there were few women in your world? I think it's pretty common for young women I remember the first time I discovered women artists and not just male artists as a young kid. And that moment kind of changed how I thought about something. So who were those mentors for you?
Well,
I'm happy to. Judy, you want to go?
I was going to go, sure. I am a perfect specimen of somebody who has been mentored. Certainly, I talked about my family, and each of us had. But I was an undergraduate thinking about going to graduate school and getting a PhD in American political theory. And I had an undergraduate teacher whose name was Shirley Abrahamson. Probably not a coincidence that she was Jewish, but she was. She was teaching this undergraduate course and got to know me a little bit and my college advocacy on behalf of civil rights. And she said, that is a ridiculous degree to go get a degree, an academic degree. You are way too activist for that. You need to go to law school. And she literally sat me down and made me apply to law school. First, she talked me into it, and then I applied. I've often told her she gets all the credit and none of the blame. She just passed away less than 2 months ago, I think. She was for many years the chief judge of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And in many ways was the conscience of that court and was driven out by a far-right political campaign. The Supreme Court in Wisconsin is elected for 15-year terms. She served many, many decades as a justice and then chief justice. So without Shirley having told me that I really was way too activist for an academic degree, I don't think I would have ever in a million years had the guts to apply to law school. And there was only one other woman in my class. Wisconsin had 150 students, and there were quote unquote 2 girls, of which I was one.
Well, I mentioned Arthur Goldberg as a mentor in helping to steer me to this public interest opportunity, and being very encouraging and also treating me with kindness, but also seriousness, and taking the fact that I was a lawyer as seriously as any of the young male associates being lawyers were. He was happy to work with me and took my work seriously, and that was very important. When I was in law school, there were 10 women. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. There were 10 women in my class. So you could say, oh, loads out of 250. So we were pretty visible and odd ducks in many ways. Couldn't quite figure out what was going on with us. But I had a law professor who I became a special research assistant to, who had worked in Washington, and he helped me think that that was something that could happen. And, at each step of the way, there was somebody who encouraged me. In my third year of law school, I worked part-time for a law firm. And they only had one, it was one of the biggest law firms in the city. And they only had one lawyer woman lawyer who happened to be Jewish. And she had a job as a permanent, they called an associate. She was never promoted to become a partner, and that was her permanent job. And the law firm would meet at a private club once a month in the evening to talk about the firm business. And this club would not accept women members. And as a woman, you were not allowed on the first floor. You had to go in a basement entrance. And it never crossed the mind of any of those senior partners who were going to that private club that this was a firm that they had a few young Jewish lawyers, could never be a member. And for this woman and for me, we had to go through a basement entrance to get to the meeting room and could not be on the first floor with everybody else. And there were a couple young Jewish, interestingly enough, male associates in that firm who were involved in being public defenders to represent indigent criminal accused in criminal cases, and one of them started the first public interest law firm in Philadelphia. And they took an interest in trying to help me figure out in Washington what would make sense for me to do, and steered me to this law firm. So I had a lot of male mentors because I didn't have very many female mentors to look at, but I did have women lawyers to the extent that they were there who took an interest in me. And then the final person I'm going to mention, who was not Jewish, was a woman named Patricia McGowan Wald. And she married a Jewish wonderful lawyer named Bob Wald. And she ultimately became a judge on the DC Circuit and the chief judge of the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, very prominent and very successful and brilliant. And she had gone to Yale Law School at a time when Harvard Law School would not accept any women. And nobody in her family had gone to college, let alone law school. And she married, Bob Wald had 5 children. And she was the first woman lawyer I ever met or heard of who had children and practiced law, and let alone 5 children. That really seemed pretty extraordinary. And she worked in a part-time arrangement at the Center for Law and Social Policy where I was. And as I struggled with lawyers on the other side of cases or had other kinds of issues, I would go to her for help and advice. And she was a huge mentor. And as is true, I think, for many people, you think of mentors often, and I do, of people who take an active interest in you and help steer you in good directions. and take you seriously and believe in you. But mentors can also be people who you model yourself after, even if they're not aware of necessarily helping you. And I paid a lot of attention to those few women who were successful in trying to figure out, well, what made them successful and what was the manner and how were they able to be professional and how did it work? And one final thing I will say about being a woman lawyer in Washington, the government, the federal government had hired women as lawyers when the private sector wouldn't. And so Washington was a city that had many more women lawyers than other cities in the country, including many lawyers who were attracted by the Roosevelt administration and activist government who were progressive lawyers. And they would have group meetings to get together and support each other. And just as those two girlfriends of mine in college talked me into going to law school to begin with, and so they were really huge mentors. Women in Washington were supportive both of starting my organization and also mentors of mine, either to try to help me directly or as role models.
So for me, three things. Number one, hard to count how many people were served as such important role models for me, but I do know I really looked for role models and mentors when I was in law school, and I found them in two places. One, we used to have conferences. I don't know if they still do anymore, women in the law conferences at law schools around the country. And I do recall being in the company of a number of practicing lawyers who were incredibly inspiring. The other group, which was much more active and vibrant then than now, was a group called the National Lawyers Guild. And I also found lawyers of like mind who were engaged in some very exciting activities. Number two, I would say I'm 1 or 2 years behind Judy and Marcia. But for me, both of them served as very distinct, wonderful role models and mentors. And I learned an awful lot from both of them, leading
And
to
vice versa.
two important organizations. And then three, I do think a lot about being a mentor myself these days and how to be helpful to people. At the moment where I'm doing a lot of work with lawyers around the country who want to be federal judges. So I am thinking about ways of mentoring people, of being helpful. And I think it will continue to be a lifelong passion of mine to do that.
Thank you all. I find the idea of these mentors and role models and having to go and looking for them, but realizing that they're not going to fall into your lap. You want to go for these people who can be part of your lives. I'd love to hear from Jennifer and Hannah, and there are a couple questions in our Q&A and chat as well, asking the teens themselves, after hearing a little bit about your stories, how do you think that Marcia, Judy, and Nan can inspire you, but also what work would you want to go and feel that still needs to be done? They all, Judy put it so wonderfully, knowing that this isn't going to be the last stop. This is going to be something that continues beyond them. So what would you feel the next step would be? Either of you can start.
I think for me, it's strange to see how much has changed, but also how much has stayed the same. Because like, there's always going to be these very prominent issues of like sexism and anti-Semitism and racism, but some of them have dwindled over time. Some of them have increased. And there's now these more and more issues that keep popping up. The ones that I can think of now are like gun violence and climate change and all these different very prominent issues in today's day. So I think it's like I don't know, like things, you can do so much to change the world, and it doesn't really take much, but also like there's so much that it's sometimes overwhelming for one person, if that makes sense.
Well, go ahead.
No, I just want to echo everything that Hannah said. It was put very well. We've achieved so much, yet there's so much still to do. In terms of what I think I would want to do later in life relating to that, I've discovered a passion for journalism, and I think that ties into work and advocacy, because part of a journalist's responsibility is to inform the public, is to make certain issues known. And I feel like when that ties in with advocacy, making the public known of there's so much bigotry that's sort of entwined with legislation that's currently in place, or that's attempting to be put in place. And I think a journalistic responsibility would be to inform the public of exactly what that legislation entails, and, you know, how different groups are aiming to kind of take it down. And I think that those two go hand in hand. And if I'm going to continue to have this passion for journalism, that's what I'm going to end up doing.
Well, I will say as an advocate that much of what we do and have done is try to educate the public and get the attention of journalists, and that journalists have been one of the major tools for getting our issues out and our priorities understood and taken seriously. If it's covered by the press, then it's taken much more seriously by legislators and government officials. And so it is very much of a central way of ultimately making a difference. There's no doubt about it. And I wanted to say one thing about the fact that the issues may not be identical, as you pointed out, Hannah, but they're also related. And if there's anything that's clear, it's that we did not solve all of the problems that we began to work on over 40 and 50 years ago, nor did we understand what the root cause of them were in those early years to the degree that we might now, in figuring out how to get at some of the root causes and what some of the solutions may be. And of course, those solutions change over time. But when you say, you know, there are many things to do, that is true. And picking things that either are of particular issues of importance to you, or, you know, when a door opens and an issue presents itself, that may be the kind of serendipitous way of getting involved in that issue, that I don't think any of us have ever really worked by ourselves, all by ourselves. And just as we've tried to get journalists to want to take our issues seriously and our causes and our campaigns and etc., finding allies, forming coalitions, working with people in the States, working with people internationally, working as well nationally with people who are academics and doing research that can further your work, different disciplines. All of those are necessary in order to really make a difference and make change. So I think about the Me Too movement. And when we all started, the word sexual harassment didn't even exist, or the concept. But a quite extraordinary woman, Tarana Burke, kind of named this phenomenon of Me Too. And the phrase got picked up by other people, but she really, her passion and her understanding has made her at the core of some of the Me Too work. And it's certainly an area where in the 50s, one of the TV shows that you would watch all the time, or movies, was a boss chasing a male boss chasing a female secretary around the desk. And that was viewed as hysterically funny and not a thing wrong with it. And it took a lot for a number of different women, also looking for male allies as well, to name it, to explain what was wrong with it, and to fight it. And of course, that is something, as we can see in the newspapers at this very moment, is still a major, major impediment for women to be able to move up. And whether it's in school or in the workplace or in other forms where they want to be able to succeed. So I think that having a sense that the problem's too big to make a difference all by yourself. In fact, one of the most empowering things about working is that you can work with other people and find common cause. And that one of the most wonderful things about the work was getting to work with Aron and Judy Lichtman and others who become dear friends and admired colleagues, and enrich and empower your work far more than if you'd been all by yourself.
Thank you, Marcia. I think that you pass it off into what our final question is brilliantly. We're wrapping up on our hour together, and I'm going to let Hannah ask it, especially because it's tied directly to what she's talking about as knowing these issues are too big for one person, and where do we go to next?
Right. So our last question is, what are some small actions that you can think of that anyone can do to help out, even if it doesn't involve becoming a lobbyist themselves?
Well, was and am blown away by the extent to which technology allowed people like me, who are, believe me, not very tech savvy, to do get out the vote activities in 2020. And multiply me, I think, not by tens of thousands, but maybe hundreds of thousands of people who were volunteers in the middle of COVID, sitting on a chair in their bedroom, calling at-risk places for voter suppression to get out the vote. That was one tiny thing. It took me a while to master it, and a lot of help from my adult children. But by God, I could get on the computer and talk to hundreds of people and make a difference in some voter suppression activities and report problems and never leave my bedroom.
Well, I would just say, particularly having lived through this year, and how difficult it's been for all of us tonight, and our communities and our neighborhoods. Just in my little neighborhood, there's so many glaring problems. Lack of affordable housing. There are people living on the streets. They've been thrown out of their apartments. In my little neighborhood, 11 restaurants have closed. And there are little things that can be done that can be very helpful. And they may sound silly, but even distributing leaflets in your neighborhood, encouraging people to get takeout to save some of these restaurants, to go to city council for more affordable housing in your community. Little things can make a huge difference. I've always viewed advocacy as thinking very big, but starting very little. And I think issues arising in our community are just a wonderful place to start. And I just also want to commend you all for this program, but also for this very exciting museum. I cannot wait to go in 2022. And I will certainly get the word out to everyone I know to go down and take a look. So congratulations for all the work that you're all doing to make this happen.
Also, I think if there are organizations that are of interest, whether it is this fantastic new museum or advocacy organizations or research or, schools, the neighborhood kind of activities, there could be so many things where if you say, I've got X amount of time and these are my interests and skills, could you use me in a way that could make a difference? That there are lots of ways that many organizations will, and even, sort of advocacy, public policy advocacy organizations need people with all kinds of skills. You don't have to be a lobbyist in order to be very helpful for that kind of an organization, let alone many others.
Thank you all so much. I think your advocacy quote, Nan, is going to live with me for quite some time. The idea that advocacy is about thinking very big, but starting very little. I think thinking about these little steps that we can take that are going to lead to big collective action is really important and makes it feel much more manageable with yourself and your group of people around you as you are organizing your coalition. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. Thank you to the participants. There were some questions we didn't get to like usual, so I hope that you stick around and keep up to date with the Capital Jewish Museum. I believe my colleague Michelle has put some information in the chat, so you can go to our website and learn more and follow along with our updates. But stories just like Marcia's and Judy's and Nan's are a huge part of the museum and a big reason of why we're bringing these stories to life in DC. So I hope we'll see you at another future program and that you'll stay up to date with us. So thank you so much for joining us and have a great rest of your evening.